So, thank you very much for having me. I want to talk a little bit about it. I think it's very easy to think about social media from the standpoint of what apps are on your phone, what's Snapchat, what's Twitter, what's Facebook, and I think we're going to get into that and definitely on the questions. But what I like to do is take a step back and think about it. What did 2016 show us? What it really showed us was political campaign is broken. The way people were campaigning, there were different types of people running different campaigns throughout. And there was an antiquated model. Like some campaigns had huge super PACs, very broadcast heavy. They were very kind of like slow and unable to be nimble to keep up. You know, and really they kind of reflected the way that campaigns were run a decade before. On the flip side, you have the Trump campaign that was very flat and was iterative. And we'll kind of talk through what that means and how they were able to harness the power of social media to kind of force multiply that and get earned media picked it up and pushed it far and wide. You almost think of Twitter as like the tip of the communication spear. They were able to get messages out and then rely on traditional media to get it far and wide, but it was just a very, very different approach. But the reality is on campaigns, what we really are is we're in a constant war for attention. You know, the average person has 27 apps on their phone, but 5 apps constitute about 79% of the time you spend in a month. Facebook, for example, is 1 in 5 minutes on mobile. So when you're on your device, 20% of the time you're in your Facebook app. That's really like the big differential that allows it to make a huge difference. So what did Trump prove through the election? Well, one thing he did better than almost anyone else was always arming allies. No matter what he was saying, he was always pushing out, whether it was on social media, whether it was people on their cable news. They always knew what he wanted to, where he was going. And even when he pivoted, they kind of pivoted with him in real time, which is a very, very different approach. He also showed that speed kills. The amount of times that he would attack a candidate, and 12 hours later, they would come back with what they thought was the perfect response, and he'd already moved on. He was 3 moves past them. And it was really hard for campaigns because they didn't know how to respond in real time to all the things he was throwing at them. And you could see it was actually causing to kind of spin out. They weren't able to get from point A to point B because they were grappling with themselves so much. He also showed that the difference is that, you know, in DC, there's a lot of thoughts on like, we need the perfect ad. This is the silver bullet. This is the headshot. If we do this, this will take this candidate out. And what Trump proved is no, it's the everyday jabs. And you look up one day and you completely wore down the other side's defenses. Every single day they were on offense, and they used social media in order to do that, which has changed the way that people were covering it. And then the final thing, which is obviously a challenge, this is not a commentary on it, but the concept of fake news is real. 46% of Americans now, per Axios in October, believe that the media is making up stories about Trump. That doesn't mean that it's true. It means that there's an entire subsection of people who believe this is true. Within Republicans, some it's 76%, they think news stories are being made up by Trump, which by muddying the water makes it very hard to keep up with all the pieces that are going. So when you couple that with how quickly the news flow is moving, it makes it very hard, and social media is really exacerbating that throughout the process. So the question for people is, knowing that, are you structured for success? Most people aren't even staffed in a way to keep up with the demands for the new information flow. They cannot get things approved quickly enough. They don't know if they can get legal sign-off. They don't know what the communications process is. They really don't know what role people play. How do you make it suddenly bilingual? What happens is campaigns almost get paralysis because they're not structured for the way the information is flowing this day. You don't get the luxury now of getting a phone call from a reporter and saying, hey, it's 11 a.m. By 4 p.m. if you get back to me, that's totally fine. What they say is, I'm going to be live, I'm going to be out in 10 minutes, you got to move and you got to be able to go. Sometimes because they know someone else is about to move with it. And so campaigns have to rethink how they approach social media for this. And we haven't reorganized our institutions to take advantage of this. So we don't have teams who just think hour to hour. We don't have people who look a week ahead. We don't have people who look a month ahead. And so sometimes campaigns almost resemble 5-year-olds playing soccer, where they run wherever the ball is because that's the only way that they know how. And as a result, they lose fact of that they're trying to actually win an election, which has become a huge problem. And are you able to move at the speed of politics? This is a thing. I mean, even big brands are seeing this now. I'm sure people look at campaigns and they think, you know, if I was in charge, this is what I would do. And then you look at these big brands, something big happens, and it takes 4 or 5 days to respond. That's not a luxury we have now on a campaign or social media. So what we realize is that while we all want to talk about big data and all the pieces that come with it, the reality is while we may be in an era of big data, it's also small content. You have to get things out quickly. And the idea of getting it perfect is actually less than getting it out there to have a response, because once the frame occurs, it's almost too late to push back. And so this is what a lot of campaigns are dealing with. But the other challenge is, and I think we've seen this with Cambridge Analytica, is we've almost overcorrected where we think data solves all. And that the reality is that the pendulum has kind of overdone it, so we think that we need to know everything about you. The problem is we may know a lot about you as a voter, but that doesn't mean we have anything to say. And if you have nothing to say, you can't take advantage of it. So when you look at Unskippable Labs, which is Google's in-house creative firm, they will actually tell you that targeting is only 20% of the equation. 80% is still the content and the creativity. And so if you can't solve for that, and you only focus on the data and this belief belief, somehow we believe that digital advertising can change everyone's mind, that it has this amazing belief. If we believe that, everyone here would be drinking Coca-Cola all day, every day. Right? Like that's the only thing you would be doing because of the amount of targeting you could do in the messaging. It's not that they can't find you. It still has to have something to say, and it has to have a message that kind of can crack through. The other biggest single change, if you think about how campaigns and how social media has changed elections, is that actually the most weaponized part of a campaign now is research. Research and digital, that you can seed the territory before you get to television. And so it's almost think of it as death by a thousand cuts. So many campaigns historically wrote budgets where they took their budget, they figured out what 5 weeks of television was and worked it back, and then figured out what else they could do. That entire paradigm has shifted. You're going to see campaigns, the reason they're starting so early is you want to set the narrative early. And so you're starting to see the research shop create all these little hooks that you can get, and social media start to push them. And so now what we're learning is a link is a link. It doesn't matter, it doesn't have to be on the New York Times. There just has to be out there, and people start to move it around. And so this is changing the whole way you approach campaigns, because campaigns get stronger over time. They get better muscle memory, organizational structure, but oftentimes they're not ready to be attacked early. And so this is going to totally change how people approach campaigns because the amount of research that organizations are doing and the way that they're being targeted. And the other challenge is unleashing the potential of your budget. We saw this in 2016. I mean, for example, how much people spend on television, and yet the inability to move people's numbers as they went through. It's not that television isn't a huge value, it's at what value? I used the Right to Rise campaign in New Hampshire, for example. They were buying broadcast in Boston to reach primary voters in New Hampshire. For every $1.6 million they spent on broadcast in Boston, they were reaching 3.2% of New Hampshire primary voters in the Republican primary. So that meant that while the Right to Rise spent $1.6 million, the Ted Cruz campaign could spend $45,000 on Facebook and counter that if you believe it's a one-to-one. Even if you believe that television is 4 times more powerful than digital, which is totally fine, for $160,000 they were able to offset the $1.6 million. It's totally changed how campaigns raise their money, and the problem is most of the campaigns that have gotten very good at raising it still aren't very good at spending it. And so because they're just not structured that way. The other challenge that we're finding too is that people aren't realizing on social media people are consuming differently. In a television spot, there's kind of the opening, it builds to an arc, then you tell a final story and you end with your brand. That whole model has broken. What we're finding online now, if you have a 30-second ad on digital, people will drop off after 6 seconds. They're not even giving you the chance to get to that point. We are seeing more completions of 15-second ads than 30. I wouldn't even run a 30-second ad on a mobile device anymore. And so what that means is you rethink the storytelling. Now you start high, you come down, you have unexpected pivot, and then you end with the part that has learned more. You give people the choice to self-select to find out more, but it totally changes because campaigns were always predicated on, like, if I get them to this 20-second mark, they'll tell me something new. Unfortunately, if your audience is gone, it doesn't matter how great that final pivot was. And yet campaigns still tell themselves. I mean, if you look through the 2016 campaign, could you tell the difference between any of the governor's spots? They all cut taxes. They were all the best for their state. Like, you could change any of their faces and you wouldn't know the difference, and yet they wouldn't understand that. So that's a huge part of it as we look through. The final thing to really think about is also, we talk about this a lot, the future is 9 by 16, not 16 by 9. So what do I mean by that? This is a television screen, but the future is your mobile phone, looking top to bottom. What does that look like? We actually, in our firm, have stopped creating any creative that's not mobile first. We only make 1 to 14-second spots, and all of our creative is on that. And it sounds crazy, but as we see more and more, the movement, the second someone gets this type of experience on their mobile device, they're starting to pop out. And so if you want to actually have people participate, I mean, there's 100 million hours are viewed on mobile on Facebook every day. I mean, the volume is there. And so you have to be able to acknowledge that, well, you may not like it, or you may not think it's right. That is how people are consuming. And if you don't go to how consumers are actually consuming the information, they will block you out. It doesn't matter how great your message is. If you're not in there, you're missing out. The other thing that's compounding this is that what we have is this whole off-the-grid movement where people aren't watching live television anymore. People don't know, for a lot of generation, I mean, 1 in 3 likely voters didn't watch live television last week other than sports. So they don't think of Modern Family as 8 p.m. on a Wednesday. They think about it when they want to watch it. They don't think of Modern Family as a 30-minute show. They think of it as a 22-minute show because they DVR it and they fast forward through the commercials. But if you can't understand how people's consumption is changing, it's impossible to understand how actually to activate them. But what does this all mean? And how do you think about the future? The thing is about it, and what hasn't changed though, is when people are always wondering what's the next thing, like what's the next Snapchat? How are we going to change how we talk to young people? The reality is the fundamentals haven't changed. We get caught up in kind of all the motion, but there's no movement. There are still truths. You still have to be authentic. You still have to have a message. The question that campaigns should be asking themselves is not what's going to be different tomorrow, but what will be the same in 10 years? What do people want to hear? And then think about how do I leverage this medium to be successful on that? Because too often we're so caught up in chasing our tails to say, this is the latest and greatest, this is the shiniest object humanly possible, and losing sight of the fact that what campaigns are really trying to do at the end of the day is still win. And the way that they can win is to get their message out to more people in a way that people can respond to. Not every race is 50-50, but when you get to a point where it really comes down to it, campaigns should be about getting someone over the finishing line and making sure they have the greatest chance for success. And I think one of the things we've kind of lost our mind in the social media age, both of how we're consuming information, but also how we think it's actually being implemented against us. And the reality is campaigns haven't changed that much, but the structure of how to be successful has fundamentally changed. So I hope that was helpful for people just for kind of a construct of how we look at campaigns, and I look forward to any questions at the end.